So, after I did one of the longest videos of my career defending the 8 original Disney princesses, I got several comments asking for a Prince video. Not that many, I am nowhere near that popular, but enough, so here we go.
A prince? But didn't you know that...
Now, there is no corresponding Disney Prince franchise, and even though there was a short-lived Spear counterpart called the Disney Adventurers or Heroes, it had characters like Peter Pan, Tarzan, Hercules, and apparently Simba, who I personally wouldn't class as Disney princes, even though Simba is a prince who becomes a king. So for the purposes of this video, I am classing Disney Prince as the love interest of the 8 original Disney princesses, leaving out the likes of Flynn Rider, Hans, and Kristoff, and there will be notes on Prince Naveen, who, disclaimer, you are still allowed to like and connect with even if I have issues with him, and vice versa to pretty much every character. So shall we? This poor guy doesn't have an official name, and some sources say Florian or Frederick, but I don't take that as canon. And right off the bat, we have some nonsense going around the internet to clear up. Imagine that. Snow White's prince is not 31. This stems from this Twitter user who cited the book The Art of Walt Disney, but in said book they give the prince's age as 18. So, you see what a few minutes of fact-checking can accomplish? And even besides supplementary materials, the choice of casting is also important to consider.
Constant and true.
The prince is played by Harry Stockwell, who was an operatic tenor. In the world of opera and musical theatre, a tenor codes an innocent, naive, and love-struck boy who wears his heart on his sleeve. And if you have a tenor playing the part, he's meant to be young.
I liked my memories as they were, but now I'll leave, remembering all.
And if Princey were intended to be 31, they would not cast a tenor in the role. Case in point, Jeremy Brett actually was 30 when he did My Fair Lady, and they dubbed him over because his voice sounded too mature for Freddie. It's also important to remember the real-life technical issues that shaped the prince's role in the story. This was 1937, and that's only when the film was released. Animation was still a very new medium, and Disney themselves had never made a feature film before, let alone one with realistic human characters. For reference, here's their short The Goddess of Spring. Animating a more cartoonish character has its own challenges, but it also has the benefit of being different enough from a real human that the brain accepts it, whereas a character that is intended to be close to human but doesn't quite make it sets off an uneasy reaction that we call the uncanny valley. They didn't have that name in the 1930s, but Uncle Walt was well aware of it, and had all his animators attending life drawing classes and studying frame-by-frame references of live-action film. Snow White herself was achieved through a then cutting-edge technique called rotoscoping, where animation is traced over live-action footage. Even then, she was such a challenge that you can see how some scenes are staged to minimize her screen time. Someday My Prince Will Come focuses more on the dwarf's reactions to her singing, Whistle While You Work emphasizes the animals, and she literally goes upstairs to take a nap in the second act. I also want to remind people that Disney literally ran out of money during production, and had to basically bring what they had of the film to the bank to beg for a loan. So are people understanding why Princey doesn't have the biggest role?
Oh! Hello.
Disney's original intent for the prince was that the queen would lock him up in the dungeon after learning about his attraction, hence why she's giving them the stink eye here. She would use her magic to make the skeletons of her previous victims dance, Snow White's bird friends would help free him, and an earlier draft included some Douglas Fairbanks-style swashbuckling along the way, to which I say, fuck yeah. If you're a hardcore Disney fan, things may be sounding familiar to you, and we will get to that. But yeah, I would have loved to see a Snow White where the prince duels with skeletons of the queen's previous victims, because it would have both made the romance feel epic, and give us more time with this character who, honestly, I really like. He's got a nice costume and overall design, and Harry Stockwell's performance of one song hits just the right balance of being romantic without feeling too drippy.
Only for you.
He puts a lot into that one musical number that I feel often goes overlooked. Considering this entire role was cut down to 2 scenes and he only has 2 lines of spoken dialogue, he knew how to make his limited screen time count. And also, considering that the prince in the original fairy tale only shows up at the end, and his sole contribution is ordering the coffin to be moved and dislodging the apple piece by complete accident, this isn't a bad expansion on the character's role. I've had it pointed out to me that his lines are ambiguous enough to suggest that he and Snow White actually have met before, and likewise, when Snow sings I'm Wishing, she specifically says, the one I love, which could be taken to mean this specific person. So if love at first sight isn't your jam, then there's enough wiggle room for headcanon.
Wait, please. Don't run away.
But even if this is their first meeting, it works in the overall way the film is presented. Rachel from the channel Girl on Film detailed that to be a true fairy tale film rather than just a fantasy film with fairy tale elements, the story should be simple, beautiful, whimsical, and weird, all of which best describe the 3 fairy tale movies made under Walt Disney. And to be a true fairy tale in general, the story has to take place in a fictional location in a non-specific time period. So we have a vaguely Germanic setting where the characters speak with American accents, and the princess has a contemporary hairstyle and costume that doesn't belong to any particular time period. Another key component of fairy tale is that things which would be unusual to us in everyday life are presented in a matter-of-fact way that allows us to accept the reality they take place in without question. Like, of course the evil queen has a magic mirror that tells us who the fairest in the land is. Of course Rapunzel's hair grows long enough that the witch uses it to climb her tower. And of course a murdered little boy comes back as a bird to get revenge on his wicked stepmother in the juniper tree. I'm a sicko, I love that one. The fairy tales don't explain why these things happen, because in their universe, such things are normal, so you may as well ask why they don't explain why humans breathe. And in Disney's Snow White, which is structured more like a folktale than a traditional Hollywood film, the prince and princess can indeed fall in love at first sight through the course of one song. And a fairy tale's purpose is to be either a warning or a parable. The Disney version of Snow White is therefore a warning on the destructive power of jealousy and being careful who you trust, and then a parable on maintaining a positive attitude in tough times, working hard to make your own personal world a better place, and having faith in the ones you love. And at that, it more than succeeds. The romance between the prince and Snow White may not be the most layered or developed, but I watched another fairy tale themed film called The Thief of Baghdad and fell in love with it, especially for a scene where the main couple literally fall in love at first sight and you buy it wholeheartedly, because the story has a lyrical tone that is all about beauty and passion, and that's exactly the same feeling Snow White gives me.
Let lips do what hands do.
Similar is Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, which turned the play into a guilty pleasure of mine, and they even seem to nod to the play with the prince serenading the princess while she's on the balcony. They weren't able to make the romance epic or developed because of budget and technical limitations, but they were able to make it beautiful and passionate, and the result is that I feel the power behind this ending. At this point in the story, the prince has been searching everywhere for the woman he loved, and discovers that she seemingly died, so all he can do is say goodbye and pay his respects, which gives the ultimate happy ending when the kiss wakes Snow White up and guarantees everyone's happily ever after. We've spent so long deconstructing and subverting happily ever after and trying to bring real-world logic into the world of fairy tales that it's easy to forget that sometimes happily ever after works just fine on its own. Moving on. Another dude without an official in-movie name, but I've heard Henry banded about, and some sources even suggest that this guy actually is Prince Charming, and one parade in 1971 named him
Prince Otto August Ferdinand.
Burrow unfortunately seems to be the least popular of the princes for his limited screen time, and he's extremely rare at the parks, since even Snow White's prince got one song and saved the day at the end, but all the saving here is either done by Cinders herself or intermediaries. People are also a lot more forgiving of Snow White's prince, since it's more widely known that he was meant to have a larger role and they just weren't able to fit him in. But the same is also the case with Cinderella, and people don't remember that as much since it was released in the inoffensive year of 1950, and the history books say that it was the 12th film Disney released, so therefore they knew what they were doing by then, right? People need to remember that World War II was only 5 years ago, and the war had resulted in massive financial losses for Pinocchio, Bambi, and Fantasia because of the European box office, so the studio had been stuck making package films for most of the 1940s. Cinderella was planned as a return to proper feature films, but the budget wasn't that high, because they wanted something safe and inoffensive that would make its money back and bring the studio out of debt. This is why the movie has extended sequences emphasizing the animal characters, because human animation is tough. You can see this in scenes such as Cinderella serving breakfast, where you only see her going in and out of the rooms and just hear people's voices without cutting inside. Likewise, Lady Tremaine's introduction has her sitting up in bed to minimize the amount of movement needed. So yes, this is going where you think it is. Cinderella's prince had a slightly larger role originally, including an introduction scene where he'd seemingly be hunting a stag, and it would turn out they were just friends playing a game. There would be another scene to set up the girl who fits the slipper plot point, where he dreams of Cinderella after the ball and gets a song called The Face That I See in the Night. And then finally, a scene where he meets her after she produces the other slipper, and this gets used in the 2015 remake where it is quite beautiful.
Will you take me as I am? An honest country girl who loves you.
Of course I will.
As it stands in the finished film, his only sequence is the ball, and then of course briefly appearing at the wedding at the end. Now, I've said before, this is one of the rare Disney films where I actually prefer the live-action remake, and a major part of that is the prince's expanded role, with Richard Madden of course being great in the part.
Only if you will take me as I am. An apprentice still learning his trade.
But just because I may prefer the live-action, it doesn't mean the animated version is bad. My lack of outright love for it is actually more for the overemphasis on the animal characters. I don't mind that we don't see as much of the prince, pretty much because I appreciate the budget limitations, and I'm returning to my previous argument in favour of Snow White's prince because so many of the bad faith criticisms judge these stories by standards they were never supposed to meet. Cinderella is a fairy tale, it is not a romance movie. There is a romance in it, but that's not what the movie is about. Cinderella is a parable that is supposed to inspire goodness in how the main character is in an impossibly difficult situation that she can't escape from, and the only thing she can do is remain a good person in spite of the horrible way her family treats her, with the story rewarding her for this by having the prince fall in love with her and enable her to escape to a better life. It is not a manual on how to have a healthy relationship, nor is it meant to be a realistic depiction of everyday life. And it differs from a high or low fantasy setting with its own rules and lore, like Tangled, which uses the Rapunzel story as foundations to tell something original, and comes up with logic and explanations for why the fairy tale tropes happen in universe.
A single drop of sunlight fell from the heavens.
Cinderella is more obviously a fairy tale because of how simplistic the story is, with even the art style having this fantastical quality to it, with a heavy inspiration from the modernist art of Mary Blair. Cinderella is in its own specific world where fairy godmothers appear out of nowhere, turning pumpkins into carriages and mice into horses, and giving the heroine enchanted shoes made of glass. So because it's so stylized, it's easy for me to buy Cinders and the prince falling in love over the course of one night. And honestly, I buy them more as a couple than Anna and Kristoff in Frozen, because that movie was so concerned with bringing real-world logic into the world of a fairy tale that it was hard to accept the actual fairy tale tropes they didn't deconstruct. And for whatever reason, this seems to be the prince who gets the most nefarious traits projected onto him. And I think this speaks less to a flaw in the movie and more to weird priorities in our culture today, where a lot of stories center male characters who are walking red flags and present that as normal, whereas tropes like Prince Charming are considered quaint or outdated, when there's still a lot of value to be had in the story.
Pretty plot for fairy tales, sire, but in real life.
This is a prince who had an entire ball thrown for the purpose of finding him a wife, meaning he's got plenty of choice, and from the sounds of the girls introduced, they're all high-ranking, and the one he notices and falls in love with is the poor servant girl, who, yeah, did have supernatural help to look that good, but still, the principle of the thing. Another lesser discussed moral of the Cinderella story is that the heroine is basically on the lowest rung of society, with nothing whatsoever to make her useful or desirable, except that she's a good person, and she's the one who is chosen by the prince, as in the next in line to the throne, and in the days of absolute monarchy, considered to be given that right divinely. So the intended moral is that kindness and goodness is enough to make you worthy in the eyes of one of society's highest ranking people. Now, I can't also let this guy's section go by without a mention of the direct-to-video sequel, or rather the third in the trilogy, Cinderella 3: A Twist in Time, which gives the prince a much expanded role, and that is one of many reasons it stands above the other sequels released in this time. Oh, and this moment.
I forbid you to take another step down these stairs! Okay.
While it's good, it also has a completely different art style with a different creative team and voice cast, so I don't consider it canon, and neither does Disney. And that being said, I don't have the same negative feelings towards his movie 1 incarnation that so many others do. Moving on. Okay, nobility, royalty, gentry, and everyone else, stop your grinning and drop your linen because it's time for the goat to make his appearance.
Now, Father, you're living in the past. This is the 14th century.
1959's Sleeping Beauty was the last fairy tale film Uncle Walt worked on, and it was intended to be an extremely prestigious production, and not just because it incorporated the music from Tchaikovsky's ballet, but also for a very ambitious art direction that deviated massively from the Disney house style. And during the development process, everyone fell in love with the expanded roles of the three good fairies, and the film eventually turned into a sort of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern perspective flip of the original tale, where the prince and princess are supporting characters, and the focus is on the fairies trying to save them from Maleficent. But now, after 3 decades in the game, Disney's animators were finally confident in doing a realistic human male, so this was a fairy tale film that would have a prince who did something. He also got a name, them choosing Philip after the husband of the recently crowned Elizabeth II of England, and many of the ideas they planned for the previous 2 princes were given to him. Like in Snow White, they have the lovers meet beforehand, although here it's definite that Philip and Aurora don't know each other, unless Aurora's dreams of a handsome prince mean she's clairvoyant.
We've met before.
We have?
Well, of course. You said so yourself. Once upon a dream.
Philip is first entranced by Aurora's beautiful singing voice in the forest, but is somewhat divinely forced into her presence when her animal friends steal his clothes for her to roleplay her fantasy with an owl, and this guy pretty much uses the pickup line, "Well, I'm here, what are your other 2 wishes for the genie?" And I say somewhat divinely because, as everyone knows, the story of Sleeping Beauty starts with an evil fairy cursing the princess to die, and good fairy Merryweather changes it to simply an eternal sleep to be broken with true love's kiss. And it's implied and outright confirmed in Maleficent that the former curse will find ways to still be fulfilled. So the reverse implication can also be true of Merryweather's spell, which is also a handy way to explain why Maleficent's minions spent 16 years not comprehending basic aging.
All these years they've been looking for a baby.
And the idea of magic guiding Philip and Aurora together so that she'll have someone to break the curse is one I like. And the dance they share is given a similar fantastical treatment to So This Is Love from Cinderella, so my earlier statements about this being a fairy tale rather than a realistic romance also apply. They also introduce a little Shakespearean irony in how both Philip and Aurora each believe the other to be a regular peasant, but the viewer knows they're actually betrothed since birth, and therefore the happy ending is telegraphed from the misunderstanding in the second act. But the real story for Philip unfolds when he visits the cottage believing he's meeting Briar Rose, and Maleficent has set a trap for him, knowing all about how the fairies modified her curse, and plans to keep him locked up for 100 years, after which she'll set him free and then he can break said curse for what they call a May-December romance. Although in this scenario it's more likely May and 2 Aprils away. Yes, this is a plot point that was planned for Snow White's prince, though Maleficent doesn't make skeletons dance for his amusement, and in fact throws a party that he can't even see. She really is the mistress of all evil. All joking aside, the final act of Sleeping Beauty is absolutely perfect. The fairies having to sneak inside the Forbidden Mountain, and Philip having to fight his way out as Maleficent's minions chase them, them all having to outrun Maleficent herself and all the obstacles she throws at them, including a forest of thorns, before she pulls out the big guns and transforms into a f***ing fire-breathing dragon. This sequence was beyond epic to me as a 5-year-old, where I would watch it and then go upstairs to recreate it with my toys, even though I didn't have toys of either character, a mistake that has since been rectified. So there was a lifelong bond between Philip and myself that was forged in Maleficent's fire and will never be extinguished, even though she herself was. Philip I just love as a character. Aladdin is great, so is the Beast, and Flynn Rider is fine, but there's no topping the OG. Okay, he's technically part of the OG 3, and it's funny, but we seem to think of the Prince Charming as something that was everywhere, and in fairy tales sure, but this was only the 3rd such movie Disney made, and they were already playing around with the trope by the 5th. So in an accidental way, Philip feels kind of unique. I mean, the only other Disney character who's even close to being similar is Kit from Cinderella 2015, and I suppose Eric from The Little Mermaid. Philip gets to be both the action hero and the dashing love interest. He's a sensitive guy who hears a beautiful singing voice and romances the girl it belongs to without a thought to the class difference, even telling his father that he'll give up the throne for the sake of love. And yes, it's played for comedy, but then he also gets to prove he's a stone-cold badass by fighting his way out of the Forbidden Mountain and slaying a fire-breathing dragon, who also conjured up other obstacles that he just fights through because no one is going to stop him from saving the woman he loves. And hey, he shows no problem deferring to women when they clearly have more knowledge and power than him, and all the heroics are at their instruction.
The sword of truth flies swift and sure, that evil die and good endure.
Philip's characterization is simple, yes, in the same way Luke Skywalker's is, and while I was never that into Star Wars, I always preferred him to Han, and likewise in the MCU I preferred Cap to Iron Man. I recognize the same traits in Philip that I found compelling in Spartacus in that show I won't shut up about. encompassing the full spectrum of masculinity in being brave and powerful, but also gentle and loving.
She was the sun, never to rise again.
Of course, Spartacus is a lot greyer, but I could have seen Andy Whitfield play a great live-action Phillip when he was younger, and while I go on about how Ariel is the Disney character I relate most to, I identify a lot with Phillip in too many ways to describe in one section of an already very long video. But I've already mentioned live-action now, and people who know about my irrational hate for the Maleficent movie may be possibly putting two and two together, and suspecting that a major reason for my dislike is in what it does to Phillip. He doesn't get quite as butchered as the three fairies in Stefan in the name of this ungodly Draco and Leatherpants fanfiction that Angelina Jolie was far too good for, but yeah, not a fan. I was even so disgusted at that movie's storyline, I was really keen on adapting my own Sleeping Beauty retelling that probably won't happen now, either due to me being a lazy slob or trying to get funding in Ireland being more impossible than breaking Maleficent's curse. But anyway, to reiterate, Phillip is extremely underrated among the Disney characters, and I think I'd rank him second behind Ariel in terms of my favourites overall. Maybe it's just projection, or maybe just after umpteen parodies and subversions, as well as needless deconstructions, simplicity when done this effectively is all the more refreshing. Oh, and speaking of Ariel, the first Renaissance prince, and actually the last truly straight example of a Prince Charming character not just Disney, but most of Western animation. He gets a larger role than his predecessors, but because the story is still very much about Ariel, he's prone to being dismissed as a plot device who's just nice. Which accurately describes the way the sequel treats him, but I quite like Eric. And considering Ariel was my girl in my warped little brain for more years than I'd care to admit, you know that the man she did tie the knot with would have to be a good one for me to accept her not doing so with me.
Eric, you've got to get away from here!
No, I won't leave you!
Anyway, Christopher Daniel Barnes is really nice in the role, and yes, he may be Spider-Man 2, but superhero comes second to Disney Prince in terms of coolness factor in my eyes. As we all know, The Little Mermaid was made 30 years after Sleeping Beauty, and was arguably just as innovative in ways that can be hard to appreciate, since its formula has been done over and over again. It wasn't just a fairy tale film with a couple of songs. This was a 2D Broadway musical, where the soundtrack would be instrumental in shaping the story and characters. This more obviously applies to Ariel, since it's her story, and it expands on the mermaid's arc from the fairy tale to make the entire movie about her finding a coming-of-age sense of identity.
What would I give to live where you are?
Eric doesn't get a song, though One Step Closer from the stage version is lovely, but his coming-of-age arc is intertwined with Ariel's. Both have more human flaws than the idealized protagonists of the previous three films. Ariel being rebellious and impulsive, and that's setting up the movie's main conflict. Eric, meanwhile, is a boy who has to become a man, with the film literally opening on his birthday, and his manservant Grimsby later revealing that he did not marry an off-screen princess who presumably would have been a good political match, because Eric wants to marry for love. And that's actually a pretty rare trait to be given to a male royal, but noticeably occurs a lot with Disney princes, to further sell the idea that the princesses are of that much worth.
The entire kingdom wants to see you happily settled down with the right girl.
This is a departure from the fairy tale, where the prince is a plot device for the mermaid to fall in love with and never have her affections returned, so she can instead die as sea foam and earn a soul through 300 years of good deeds, and possibly more if she sees bad children misbehave. That ending is more manipulative than when my parents said I'd get square eyes if I watched too much TV. The movie gives Eric the same plot beats from the original, in that he's saved by a mysterious woman and dreams about her, never once thinking it's the mermaid herself, but improves on it in my opinion. Eric regains consciousness as Ariel sings to him, and so he obsesses over a possible dream girl that saved him, with the only clue being her beautiful voice. And now with the Sea Witch having been turned into the main villain, she intentionally makes Ariel trading her voice part of the deal to turn her human, whereas in the original it was just part of the spell. So this adds some of that same Shakespearean irony that Sleeping Beauty did, where the audience knows that Ariel is the girl with the beautiful voice he's been dreaming about, but because she can't speak, she's the one girl Eric is sure she can't be. But Eric falls in love with her anyway after spending some time with her and letting her be her delightfully oddball self.
I know.
My.
So sorry, Grim.
And although Ursula sabotages an almost kiss, there is additional conflict from Eric still not being willing to let go of this unattainable ideal he keeps thinking of, and Grimsby has to remind him that he shouldn't get lost in his dreams and ignore the very real girl right in front of him that he's obviously got a thing for.
Far better than any dream girl is one of flesh and blood. One warm and caring, and right before your eyes.
For all the bad faith takes claiming the movie promotes bad messaging, here's an actually good message that's all the more relevant in today's perfection-focused society. Don't waste your life chasing the ideal. Yeah, he lucks out by Ariel actually being the girl with the beautiful voice, but still, he's already made the decision to go to her before he finds that out. But then... and Eric ends up as a dude in distress for the second time in the film. And that part of the movie rarely gets talked about enough. Probably because acknowledging it would break the attempts to insist Ursula just offered Ariel an honest deal. But at this point, it's almost sunset. And Ariel knows she's going to be Ursula's plaything soon. And it's not just about potentially getting that kiss in spite of her. The man she loves is under the control of a monster who doesn't care who she exploits in her quest for power. And Ariel might not be able to save herself, but she's going to try and protect Eric from what Ursula is capable of. And really, Bro is put through a lot in the space of one evening. First, he's mind-controlled by a sea witch and forced into an extremely unconsensual marriage, and once the spell has worn off, probably has to comprehend that he nearly had to spend a wedding night with this thing. Then he learns about the existence of mermaids and sea witches right before the woman he loves is kidnapped by his shotgun fiancé. But what's actually rather heartwarming is that in learning that Ariel is the girl with the beautiful voice, he also quickly guesses that she saved his life when she didn't know him, and then also swam all the way from the mainland to save him again at great personal risk. So you can more than understand this line.
Grim, I lost her once. I'm not gonna lose her again.
And then we see Eric return the favor, making for a very satisfying moment when he harpoons Ursula from behind, being like, "Witch, that girl didn't need any magic to hook me, so don't go celebrating just yet. Also, I got a dog with a good memory who thinks the teeth marks in your derriere could use some neighbours." But back to seriousness. This sees Disney introducing the battle couple trope to the princess films, since Ariel is a more action-oriented character and the first princess with a kill count. And it is very nice to see something made in the late 80s not make fun of Eric for needing to be saved by a girl twice. The movie doesn't make a big deal about it, being like, well, of course that's what you do for someone you love. And then, of course, the extremely memorable finale, which probably comes in second behind Sleeping Beauty, and it draws heavily from that. Eric is another prince who really has to work for his happy ending, and the movie cleverly established him as a sailor in 2 scenes beforehand, this actually giving the setup a little bit of irony in how the merfolk are completely powerless against Ursula when she's in this form, and it falls to a human to stop her, and that adds a lot of power to the ending, since the movie's central conflict was Triton's prejudice of humans, which Ursula exploited to get Ariel under her thumb. And then Triton is the one who gave Ursula all this power in an attempt to fix the mess he landed them all in because of said prejudice. And it's a human of the race he hated and feared that saves the day, and is responsible not just for him being restored to power, but also freeing every one of Ursula's victims by killing her. But you can imagine this all gets lost in the huffing and puffing about how Ariel doesn't save herself. Even though she's in trouble because it's a combat situation that she inserted herself into, and she already saved Eric twice, and this means they're 2 for 2. And if you think about it, the bad faith critics really have to downplay Eric's role in order to make their take on Ariel sound like it has a point. We've already established that she did not in fact give up anything beyond a life she wasn't happy in, but the guy she chose to marry? Well, her first impression of Eric was him going back onto a burning ship to rescue his dog, and before that he'd also helped Grimsby get to safety, and then when she properly meets him, he immediately takes this seemingly shipwrecked foundling into his castle to see she's taken care of and provided for, and he treats her very well, showing her around his kingdom and letting her have fun, also never attempting to suppress her eccentricities, which he's also charmed by. Then we get into the big stuff, like him risking his life to help her because she did the same for him, and finally harpooning a giant sea monster to save her life. All of that is worth at least a second date.
Facts are horrid things.
And as I've said multiple times, the time skip to the wedding is vague, so the people who can't just accept it's a fairy tale, go with it, can also headcanon that they took their time getting to know each other before tying the knot. Which is actually what would happen in real life, since both are royalty, and there would need to be a courtship period of a few months to keep things appropriate. And the marriage also seems to have fostered good relations with Atlantica, judging from all these smiley, happy mer people at the wedding, since let's remind ourselves that Eric is responsible for freeing hundreds of them from being Ursula's prisoners, and getting rid of a dangerous predator, so he's likely a national hero by this point. Just like how I say with Ariel there are worse fictional characters you could look up to, with Eric there are worse guys you could take a chance on and risk everything for love. And the course of making this video has made me appreciate him a lot more, because he is a really good character when you think about it. Next. Before we dive into Disney's super definitive take, it's very important to examine the origin of this story and what it was saying at the time. Beauty and the Beast was published in 1740 in a French magazine specifically aimed at girls and women. The Beauty in the title is a young woman who in fairy tale tradition is the youngest of 3 siblings, with the older 2 being shallow and spoiled and Beauty herself being virtuous and humble. Some versions highlight this when the sisters demand their merchant father bring them back dresses and jewels, even though they nearly lost their fortune, and Beauty just asking for a simple rose. This ends up nearly getting her father killed when he plucks one from the Beast's garden, and must make a promise that she has to come and live with the Beast in his castle in exchange for his life. And we pretty much know the story from there.
Love can make a man become a beast, and love can also make an ugly man beautiful.
It was written to inspire a more direct lesson in the magazine's female readers, that being to prepare them for an arranged marriage that would dictate not just their future, but also that of their family, and also internalize the lesson that their new husbands might seem scary or intimidating, but they could grow to love them if they just looked past appearances. But of course, the world changed slightly between 1740 and 1991, and Disney guessed that the story's moral would have to be reframed for modern audiences.
Well, you should learn to control your temper.
We also have to mention that Disney's Beauty and the Beast takes a great deal from the 1946 French adaptation by Jean Cocteau, not just visually, but also in adding touches such as naming the heroine Belle, making the entire castle enchanted, and giving Belle a human suitor to make a love triangle with the Beast. And in this version, the same actor plays the Beast's human form, with Jean Cocteau presenting the transformation as something of a downgrade, and Hollywood star Greta Garbo reportedly left the screening saying, "Give me back my Beast." The Disney animators likewise admitted that they put very little effort into crafting the prince, feeling that the audience who'd spent 99% of the film with the Beast weren't going to be happy regardless of how good he looked. Disney makes the story a more straightforward romance. Belle is an only child, and the superficial women she's put in contrast to are now represented by a trio of dumb blondes in the village who swoon over the handsome human Gaston. And rather than making Maurice promise Belle to him, it's Belle herself who offers to take his place, with the Beast being visibly confused by the idea, and feeling bad for separating the two as soon as he has Maurice sent away. There's a delightfully awkward sequence of the servants having to tell him how to have a conversation, which is oh so relatable to us neurodivergent folks.
I hope you like it here.
And here we have the trope or character type that Disney would end up jettisoning the Prince Charming in favour of, the jerk who learns to be nice. This also adds in a karmic aspect to the enchantment, where he's a beast as punishment for refusing shelter to an old beggar woman who was revealed to be an enchantress in disguise. And for those not understanding the meaning behind this, with him being a prince and having a large castle at his disposal, if one of his subjects needed shelter from the blizzard, sacred hospitality dictated that it was his duty to let her in. By turning her away, he was condemning her to death in the cold, and therefore demonstrating that he was ignorant of his subjects' well-being, in effect shirking his responsibilities as a future ruler. This serves to make the story more equal, by giving the male and female lead their own lessons they need to learn. It's now not just Belle learning to look past appearances and love a beast, but also him learning selflessness and what it means to love someone. And there's also an arc of self-acceptance, since the prologue even states that he never felt anyone could love him.
She'll never see me as anything but a monster.
While a lot of people point to rescuing Belle from wolves as the major turning point for his character, I'd argue that it's actually this look of regret when he sees Belle crying after he sent Maurice away, and he's comprehending that he just separated a young woman from her beloved father for no good reason, and he doesn't quite understand why he feels so bad about this. So he's instantly compelled to try and make it up to her by giving her a nice room and telling her she has the run of the castle. But since of course we don't see any parents or other friends and family around, at this point he's not able to comprehend that the main way to make Belle feel better would be to let her go home and be with her father. He's obviously considered that Belle might be key in breaking the enchantment, but it's also obvious he doesn't think he has a shot. And in this part of the movie, he's almost childlike, in the sense that he's not used to being told no and thinks he can get his way through yelling and commanding, since although Mrs. Potts does attempt to get through to him, there's obviously a power imbalance with them all being his servants. Basically, he's never been taught basic communication skills or to respect other people's boundaries. But we even do see signs of growth before Belle runs away, since it's clear he's full of self-loathing at his own inability to connect with her.
It's hopeless.
Earlier drafts of the screenplay implied that his mind did become more beast-like as part of the transformation, so it's up to you if you want to consider that canon, but it works either way if you just interpret him as a hermit who's used to getting his way and was never taught how to socialize. And with regards to rescuing Belle from wolves, he's clearly not motivated just by the chance of breaking the spell. You see here that he's immediately regretful for yelling at her, and he's been feeling bad all evening about how his behavior has been making her sad or scared, so it's obvious that he would not be able to live with himself if a person ran out of his castle terrified for her life and then got hurt or possibly worse in the blizzard, possibly also bringing back memories that the reason he's a beast in the first place is because he denied someone shelter from the cold. Then, as mentioned in my princess video, Belle calling him on trying to get his way with yelling and outbursts, but also rewarding him for good behavior puts them on a more level playing field.
Thank you for saving my life.
We see that he actually likes the feeling that comes with knowing you did a good thing, and he respects Belle enough to try and improve for her sake. He's not trying to control or manipulate her, he genuinely wants to be worthy of her. The Something There number sees a slow but effective evolution of them meeting in the middle, and just becoming good friends. The deleted song Human Again I don't like, but it does contain a nice bit at the end where Belle is reading to him, and if you recall, Gaston tried to discourage her from reading, and the entire town thought she was odd for preferring books. But the Beast encourages that side of her, and even this frame indicates that her reading to him or the two enjoying a book together became a bonding activity. And when he wants to do something nice for her, Cogsworth goes through this admittedly funny list.
Flowers, chocolates, promises you don't intend to keep.
But the Beast forgoes typical love-bombing tactics and instead shows that he understands Belle by giving her his library, which is far more romantic than the remake, where he only does this because he thinks her taste is trash and makes fun of her for liking Romeo and Juliet. Low-hanging fruit, Beastie. And when she misses her father and sees that he needs help, rather than her begging to be let go like in the original, it's the Beast who sets her free, without the "you must return within 2 months" caveat.
I had to.
Yes, but why?
Because I love her.
He lets her go, fully understanding that she won't return. And boy, does this next part of the movie hit home way more now than it did as a kid. For context, Ireland can be a really miserable place to live, though of course still miles ahead of other places. On days where I'm feeling cynical, I say the only thing shittier here than the weather is how the country treats its artists, although it's probably definitely the housing. And ever since the early 2010s, it's become a given that 80% of young people will emigrate to Canada, Australia, or somewhere else because there's really very little future here. And I have had to say that goodbye multiple times every year, while I have to stay behind for the time being. And while you can understand the reasons on an intellectual level, that doesn't change the very real heartbreak that comes with the goodbye, and subsequent absence that hangs over the life as a result. And it's never easy to live with the fact that the other person's better life is one without you in it. And as I get older and grow tired of toxic or superficial friendships, as well as repeated unrelated health problems that make travelling extremely difficult, I noted that halfway through last year I pretty much was the Beast at this stage of the film.
Too kind and gentle to fight back.
And I also hear jokes from people that Gaston is the real hero of the story, and he's probably one of the Disney villains that gets the Draco and Leatherpants treatment the most, along with Ursula and Maleficent, while the Beast is misrepresented. But here's a post on Tumblr, of all places, that actually hits the nail on the head on why Gaston is so effective as a villain.
People who deride the movie by saying it's about Stockholm Syndrome are ignoring that it's actually about the various ways in which truly decent people are othered by society. People don't trust the Beast because of the way he looks, which only feeds his anger issues and pushes him even further away. Gaston isn't the only person who criticizes Belle for being bookish. The whole town says there must be something wrong with her, and her father gets carted off to a mental institution just for being a little eccentric. Howard Ashman, who collaborated on the film's score and had a huge influence on the movie's story and themes, was a gay man who died of AIDS shortly after work on the film was completed. If you watch the film with that in mind, the message of it becomes clear. Gaston demonstrates that bullies are beloved and rewarded by society as long as they possess a certain set of characteristics, while nice people who don't possess those characteristics are ostracized. The love story between Belle and the Beast is about them finding solace in each other after society has rejected them both. Notice how the beast reacts when the whole town comes for him. He's not angry, he's sad, he's tired, and he almost gives up because he has nothing to live for. That's how badly being ostracized by society and told that you're a monster all your life can fuck with your head and make you stop seeing yourself as human. Society rewards the bullies because we've been brought up to think that their victims don't belong. That if someone doesn't fit in, they have to be put in their place or even destroyed. And this movie demonstrates that this line of thinking is wrong.
And even outside Howard Ashman bringing his own experiences as a gay man to the story, it's one of those universal metaphors that hits on multiple levels. Most obviously being autistic, where you can be denied a place in society based on it simply not wanting to accommodate you, which is true for multiple disabilities. And there's even an accent bias here that I've had people use to lecture me about why they're justified in bullying or ostracizing other people based purely on how they talk. So maybe there are multiple subconscious reasons why these days Belle returning to the castle and this scene brings on the happy waterworks.
You came back.
And the movie's power is in showing that Belle's love comes way before the transformation. While he does need to change his behaviour for her to give him the time of day, he doesn't need a physical makeover, and she actually seems a little unsure when he turns back into the prince, with it being the eyes that put her at ease.
It is you!
For all the attempts at trying to shoehorn a "this movie is problematic" narrative based around misrepresentations, the actual messaging of this film is one that I think more people should be exposed to. Boy, that was a tough one. Next will be easier, right? And here we have Disney's first fairy tale film to be based on a non-European story, and also feature an entire cast of brown characters, but voiced by white actors, unless you watch the Arabic dub of course.
Start panicking!
A detail I found out literally after I released my video on the princesses is that Agrabah was actually intended to be Baghdad outright. Because, like Beauty and the Beast, it is heavily inspired by a film from the 40s, the aforementioned The Thief of Baghdad. But the Gulf War at the time led to them renaming the city Agrabah to avoid negative associations. Though since the peddler at the start says they're still near the River Jordan, it's in any one of these places, to answer that frequently googled question. Anyway, Aladdin can be a hard film to talk about critically because, as perfect as it is, it's still Disney telling a story about a Middle Eastern culture, where the city has a mishmash of various Arab, Persian and Indian imagery, not to mention some of the lyrics in Arabian Nights.
It's barbaric, but hey, it's home.
And although this is Disney's thing, since the fairy tale films based on European stories are set in vaguely French, Germanic or Mediterranean kingdoms to nod to their origins, that has different connotations when you're doing so to a region that's historically been exoticized and stereotyped by the West. And at the same time, it's an entire story about brown people where everyone is a character, and I've heard multiple people talk about how Jasmine is one of the only positive Middle Eastern women in fiction, at least recognizably, and there's no denying that Aladdin is one of Disney's most iconic characters. So there is a lot of value to be found in the movie's existence. Just like how The Thief of Baghdad may be dated, but it still has Sabu being a heroic brown person saving the day only 1 year after Hattie McDaniel had to accept her Oscar for Gone with the Wind while sitting at a segregated table. And Aladdin at least feels well-intentioned, since layout supervisor Razul Azadani was of Iranian heritage, and consulted on the designs because the directors didn't want to offend people. But of course, the minority experience is not a monolith, and like far more polarizing films such as Pocahontas, it comes down to a preference issue. Is inaccurate but positive a deal breaker? And does being deliberately anachronistic excuse inaccuracy? Aladdin, meanwhile, is actually the only Disney prince who gets to be the main character, and we could argue that this is very much a male Cinderella story. Aladdin gets more of an edge than Cinder's because 90s, though she catches up to him in her third movie, and he's introduced as a thief and trickster before revealing that he's a good guy at heart when he gives the bread he stole to a pair of starving children, and likewise defends them from a rude prince.
If I were as rich as you, I could afford some manners.
And once again, we see Disney use that contrast between two potential romantic partners, and the first time they present a prince figure as an outright jerk in comparison to a down-to-earth poor guy, where the story spells it out that he's more than what he seems.
I'm not worthless.
It isn't a particularly radical statement for 1992, but considering a lot of guys today are still convinced they need 6 figures in the bank account to be considered desirable, it's still a relevant talking point. And like the beloved princes such as Phillip and Eric, Aladdin gets to encompass that full spectrum of masculinity, where he gets to be the sensitive guy who falls in love and is motivated by romance, as well as singing show tunes about how he wishes people would see that there's more to him, and then he still gets to have adventures and be the hero, showing that you can be both. And one of his defining attributes is his cleverness, where he saves the day by outsmarting Jafar rather than overpowering him. He's actually an extremely well-rounded character when you break it down, also with an arc that's a lot deeper than just stop being something you're not. At the time of the One Jump reprise, the movie has told us that he's the diamond in the rough worthy enough to enter the Cave of Wonders, but Aladdin takes Prince Ahmed's "only your fleas will mourn you" comment to heart. And likewise, on finding out that the girl he spent some time with was actually the princess, he's convinced she thinks he's an idiot, not knowing that Jasmine is currently crying her eyes out at the thought of him being dead.
I must have sounded so stupid to her.
I didn't even know his name.
And when he gets his hands on an all-powerful genie, his first wish is to be made into a prince so he can act like a completely different person because he can't comprehend that maybe Jasmine would love him for who he is. And although Aladdin is a thief, we saw him give up probably the only meal he'd have that day so that 2 hungry children could eat, rescue a distressed young woman from getting her hand cut off, and when he meets a supernaturally enslaved being who literally offers him anything he wants, he asks, "What can I do for you?"
After I make my first 2 wishes, I'll use my 3rd wish to set you free.
Oh, and when role-playing to get Jasmine out of bother, he doesn't make like the title character in Arthur, who uses a similar situation to give the girl an unwanted kiss. He just says Jasmine is his sister. So the second act is Aladdin ignoring his own self-worth and trying to change himself to fit in, and arguably not giving Jasmine the credit for being deep enough to love him for who he is. And the moral isn't just be yourself, but also that you can't be loved unless you learn to love yourself. And to do that, you have to accept yourself and realize your own worth. And to his credit, he hates himself for offending Jasmine in this scene and tries to make amends. And actually, while we're here, 1992 was the same year that the infamous Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus was published, and it was the era of pickup artistry, involving men learning how to manipulate women into dating them based on the idea that there are just inherent psychological differences between the two, which has been debunked to hell and back since, and unfortunately now seems to be making a comeback. So it's nice to see the movie shoot this nonsense down by demonstrating that Aladdin doesn't get anywhere with Jasmine until he actually listens to her. Though he didn't need to be so literal.
I'll go now.
No!
And as I said in my princess video, he listens to how Jasmine says she feels trapped in her palace life, and so takes her on a magic carpet ride and makes sure she enjoys the experience. But showing that simply making a love connection doesn't eradicate low self-esteem, we see Aladdin fall back on lying and pretending to be something he isn't, still convinced he won't be accepted otherwise, until the movie's universe forces the truth out and him into a situation where they need the street rat to save the day and not Prince Ali. And when all is said and done, he's finally learned his lesson and chooses setting his friend free like he promised, rather than using magic to change himself.
I gotta stop pretending to be something I'm not.
And the Sultan realizes that if he wants Jasmine to marry someone who will take care of her, he's unlikely to find anyone better, and you see what happens.
I choose you, Aladdin.
And since this is the male Cinderella story, the movie elevates the poor street rat with nothing that makes him useful in the eyes of society beyond his kindness and goodness. Although the flying carpet is also a big selling point, but that's who Jasmine loves. Disney used to do romance so well, which brings us to... Yeah, this section will be easy. Hell, even the voice actor is a hard sell, as much as I am a separate the art from the artist person. And this could have been so much easier, because do you know who was originally meant to voice John Smith?
But now winter is truly coming, and in the winter, we must protect ourselves.
Yes, give me this alternate timeline. Disney, I've defended you so much in the past year. How about as a reward you get Sean Bean to dub the dialogue as nature intended? I want the Ned Stark cover of If I Never Knew You.
But I grew up with soldiers. I learned how to die a long time ago.
And while I've avoided most of Mel Gibson's filmography, he is quite alright in the role. And dare I say, I actually enjoy his singing.
This land we behold.
But anyway, yes, Pocahontas was 12 when she first met John Smith. No, there was no romance between them, so this was not... You know, the legend of a Pocahontas John Smith romance doesn't appear until John Davis's travels in the United States of America from 1803, nearly 200 years after both their deaths. And that's the difference between a legend and a fairy tale. The latter takes place in a fictional faraway land with all sorts of fantastical elements. A Legend, however, features real people and takes place in a real location, but is still fictional. And Disney's Pocahontas is specifically adapting the legend of a romance between the two, rather than a film like The New World, which is the mostly historically accurate Pocahontas story. And the purpose of a legend is a little different to that of a fairy tale, but there is an overlap. Since legends have a grain of truth, they serve to preserve history as a fictional connection to it, as well as guide or inspire people, and likewise convey moral lessons like a fairy tale.
This is the path I choose, Father. What will yours be?
And it's documented that Disney's version initially started out with a 12-year-old Pocahontas who would speak Powhatan for half the film. When Beauty and the Beast got a Best Picture nomination, Jeffrey Katzenberg wanted another love story in the hopes of replicating that, and so they instead adapted the legend of a forbidden romance between the two, with the marketing stressing that it was based on the folklore rather than the facts. But it also drew heavily from Romeo and Juliet, and specifically the musical West Side Story, which added racial tensions to the standard star-crossed lovers plot.
I can kill now because I hate now.
It was also born from a trend in the 80s and 90s where Hollywood movies would show relations between colonialists and indigenous people in a more nuanced light than the conflict that made up the plot of several westerns throughout film history, but still falling short by showing them through the lens of a white male character. Pocahontas is actually the subversive one here, since the POV character is the indigenous woman, and the plot hinges on her feelings and motivations. So John Smith exists to be a symbol of imperialist and colonialist attitudes, with him lecturing Pocahontas on how he and the English will improve their way of life.
Our houses are fine.
You think that, only because you don't know any better.
Also, the movie can shut him down and deconstruct this attitude by way of Colors of the Wind, which isn't just my favourite Disney song of all time, but also very important as a representation of him changing his views and letting go of the beliefs that have been indoctrinated into him and multiple others across generations, with the song ending on this symbolic shot of the musket and helmet being left behind. And this isn't necessarily saying it was Pocahontas' responsibility to change him, because her first impression was seeing him playing with Miko and then lowering his weapon at the sight of her, so she was obviously like, okay, this guy has potential. And from then on, John's story becomes one of atonement, with him challenging Ratcliffe's racism and trying to convince the others of what Pocahontas taught him.
Murderous thieves, there's no room for their kind in civilized society.
But this is their land!
You'll even notice that when he's attacked by Kocoum, he tries to de-escalate the situation and defend himself without using lethal force. And this is actually an improvement in the adaptation change from Romeo and Juliet and West Side Story, which feature a relative of the Juliet analogue killed by the Romeo analogue after one of his friends was killed. And here it's Thomas who kills Kocoum trying to save John. And John takes the fall for that in a very symbolic moment, since he not only taught Thomas how to shoot, and therefore perpetuated the deaths of more indigenous people, but also representative of his atonement for his part in colonialism. And the line that will never fail to get me:
I'd rather die tomorrow than live 100 years without knowing you.
And with If I Never Knew You reinserted, it also confirms that Pocahontas helped him find meaning in life, and the courage to be a better person, so that when he faces his execution the next day, he feels he's facing the consequences of his past actions. And even when Pocahontas saves his life, he sees Ratcliffe taking aim at Chief Powhatan, and he takes the bullet in a powerful act of self-sacrifice. And as much as it breaks his heart to go back to England and Pocahontas can't come with him, he accepts this, because he respects Pocahontas' need to stay behind and help her people, as it's partly his fault that her people need that help. And our last shot of John is him saying goodbye the Powhatan way, confirming that he is indeed a changed man. John Smith is far from my favourite Disney character, and I watched this film mainly for Pocahontas, but he is more than serviceable, and successful enough as a character that I always feel all the feels at this ending.
But I can't leave you.
You never will. No matter what happens, I'll always be with you.
Next. I'm going to include Shang here since Mulan is counted as an official princess, and he's her love interest, so...
You don't meet a girl like that every dynasty.
Disney weirdly cut him out of the live-action remake, and the PR line was that with him being Mulan's commander, their romance is an abuse of power, even though she was kicked out of the army and it's actually her who asks him out once everything's over, and this decision was not received well, as Shang is quite popular for some reason. Shang also has the distinction of being the prince who gets the best song. Yes, one song is quite sweet and A Whole New World is epic, but that's a duet, and 8-year-old me didn't go around singing that half as much as I'll Make a Man Out of You.
Let's get down
down to business.
If you're wondering why Donny Osmond does the singing when B.D. Wong is also an accomplished Broadway performer, apparently Donny sounds more like him singing than his own voice. And Shang's father is voiced by the pioneering James Shigeta, also an accomplished singer, so if only we got a song between father and son.
You are beautiful.
Anyway, Shang is something of a mirror character from Mulan, who's trying to save her father and also prove her own worth, while he is given a leadership position by his father, who's also a decorated war hero like Fa Zhu, and he's motivated to prove that he deserves it and wasn't just given it out of nepotism. And while the movie is mainly about the expectations placed on women by society, there is an acknowledgement of the same for men, since we see that in private, Shang has an adorable side that he then has to suppress in order to be a super serious authority figure who then gets a satirical song lecturing his recruits about what it takes to be a man. This is also the only time the prince gets to be the mentor as well, as he provides the lesson Mulan needs to learn, that to retrieve the arrow, you need strength and discipline, and it's the latter that Mulan is lacking in. Since she tries to cheat her way around the matchmaker's interview, and Mushu is trying to help her take shortcuts in training, and it's not until Shang tells her she's unsuited for combat and tries to discharge her that she applies his lessons and understands that strength and discipline need to be utilized together to get the arrow. And something else I can appreciate is that the movie shows that a leader doesn't automatically know what they're doing, but has to make important decisions when catastrophes start happening. In this case, Shang discovering that the Imperial army has been massacred, including his father, and he has only a short amount of time to grieve before he needs to command his troops. And then again when they're ambushed by the Huns. And you could argue that this is another lesson Mulan takes to heart. And this is what allows her to rise to the occasion later when Shan Yu kidnaps the Emperor, and she thinks of a better plan, which was also foreshadowed here when she goes against Shang's orders and does the whole avalanche trick. This movie is so clever and it never gets the credit for it. But of course, the big moment for Shang's character is when Mulan is revealed to be a woman, and he's ordered to kill her because cross-dressing equals high treason. But since she saved his life, he spares her and just leaves her on the mountain. This is actually an adaptation change, since in the Ballad of Hua Mulan, she never gets found out until her comrades visit her years after the war. And everyone's headcanon is that Shang is possibly bi and developed feelings for Mulan while she was in disguise, but it's hard to pinpoint exactly when the feelings started.
For what it's worth, I think you're a great captain.
Since his reason for sparing her is...
a life for a life. My debt is repaid.
And he's pretty cold to her when he sees her again. But are those the feelings of someone especially hurt that someone they considered a friend kept a secret from them? And the Emperor does describe Mulan disguising herself as something that dishonored the army. Whatever the case, once Mulan is proved to be telling the truth about the Huns, Shang actually defers to her and follows her plan, and then it's him defending her to Chi-Fu after she saves the day, which is a lot more important than you realize.
That creature's not worth protecting. She's a hero.
Notice how 2 of the 4 songs in the movie talk about gendered expectations. Honor to Us All is Mulan being info-dumped on everything that she has to be in order to be considered a good wife. And it's all things like, be obedient, work quickly, have a tiny waist, bear sons. Then A Girl Worth Fighting For is the men singing about their dream women, and it's all superficial characteristics like physical beauty, cooking ability, and being easily impressed by whatever, with a joke that they all respond no when Mulan suggests a girl who has a brain and always speaks her mind. But notice that Shang doesn't take part. He gets no verse about whatever shallow characteristics he expects of his ideal woman, because, as it turns out, his ideal woman is the one who got a whole song about how she didn't think she could live up to society's expectations. He basically goes, "This gal defied gender expectations and broke several laws just to save her father's life, saved my neck twice, and the second time also saved China itself? Man, she's cool." And he also immediately recognizes her worth to defend her from a sexist pig. And it's also funny that once he's no longer her commander, Shang's bumbling dork side comes right back and he has no clue how to talk to girls.
You fight good.
But rather than retreating into a hole and dying forever like I would after this faux pas, he finds the courage to try again and is rewarded with a dinner invitation. You go, Disney, showing that it's okay for the girl to ask the boy out, and also subversively leaving it open where the relationship will go. But even if I don't take the sequel as canon, I do indeed picture wedding bells in their future, so this character is considerably more than an authority figure abusing his position.
Woo! Sign me up for the next war!
But it was 2 decades before we arrived at that sort of statement from Disney, so let's take a look at how we got there, and the only Disney prince we can, in good faith, call problematic. I recently heard The Princess and the Frog described as a movie made to appease your critics, and an example of why you shouldn't do so. And while I think Tiana is an okay character and could have just used 1 or 2 rewrites to be as good as her predecessors, I have less love for Naveen.
That's new.
I've already talked about how this was the first princess movie made after a good decade of bad faith criticism, and along with Enchanted, represents their first attempts at self-critiquing. That worked better in the former because it wasn't trying to do inclusion at the same time. And Naveen is almost a shameless attempt to buff the movie from any kind of criticism. He's brown-skinned with green eyes, voiced by a Brazilian actor, has an Indian name, and hails from a fictional kingdom whose language seems inspired by Italian, in a movie that is set in a realistic Louisiana of 1926, with Tiana even being inspired by business owner Leah Chase. For those who don't know, the portrayal of interracial relationships in movies that weren't about race was a bit of a talking point in the 2000s. Was it racist to portray a black man-white woman couple because that could imply that the white partner is more desirable than a black love interest? But if the couple were of the same race, were you falling into the like goes with like stereotype? And so, whichever race Tiana's prince ended up being, someone was going to get annoyed. If he was black, then Disney were going to get for not portraying an interracial relationship and playing to cliché, especially since the last interracial Disney couple notably didn't end up together. But if he was white, then there were sure to be questions about why there wasn't a black prince as well, and were they implying a black woman needed to be saved by a white man? And if he was another race, then were Disney trying to avoid both a black prince and a black woman-white man romance? And if they went down the Moana route of not giving her a love interest, was that implying black women weren't desirable? So these situations tend to be a choose how you'll fail scenario. Plus, they already chose to base the movie on a fairy tale where the girl kissing the frog is expected. What are they gonna do, have him turn back when she gets annoyed and throws him against the wall? Oh, wait. And remember that Disney had spent the 2000s seeing most of their animated films underperform or lose money, and there had been a whole decade of internet criticism about all the terrible messaging they supposedly sent. And we've already covered just how thin a creative line they were walking. Don't have the heroine be a maid, don't call her Maddie, make the title The Princess and the Frog so as not to offend the French. And I have the utmost sympathy because history has proven that you just can't accept goodwill from the audience. Especially since the 2000s saw the start of the biggest media literacy crisis that has only gotten worse since. So the prince that resulted.
You are getting married!
Oh, right. I just have to leave a string of broken hearts behind me.
I wonder if Disney had become aware that Gaston had acquired plenty of fangirls and thought that giving them what they wanted might result in a larger box office take. Because Naveen is introduced as a player and hedonist who is in New Orleans looking for a rich woman to marry because his parents cut him off. He's also shamelessly trying to pick up other women when he already knows he wants to marry Lottie, including the very heroine of the film. And once he's turned into a frog, mistaking Tiana for a princess, he gets her to kiss him despite her very obvious disgust.
I just do not kiss frogs.
And actually, she says no, very clearly, twice.
On the balcony. You asked me.
I didn't expect you to answer.
So what does he do?
Surely I could offer you some type of reward, a wish I could grant, perhaps?
Yep, he literally lies to get her to kiss him. She sets down a boundary, and he tries to get around it. He tries to coerce her into an unwanted kiss. Why is this guy the love interest? And I'm not saying Disney characters can't lie. Aladdin lies like a rug. But that is part of the story, and woven into the character's inner conflict about the world never accepting him, and it culminates in him ultimately doing the right thing and making amends to the people he lied to. And the class difference makes it so that being honest isn't exactly a good option. Not to mention that he has to hide his identity from Jafar. Naveen just gets our heroine to kiss him under false pretenses after she explicitly said no. And he wants to be turned back human so he can marry her best friend for her money. And his idea of a grand romantic gesture later in the movie is to marry someone he doesn't love so he can give her money to another woman. I was hard on Frozen for being overwritten, but I think Princess and the Frog might be worse. And you could argue that yes, Naveen is flawed, and the idea is that he changes and becomes a better person, but the fact that he's so flawed to begin with sends a message that's arguably more problematic than any of the past princess movies. Only change once you meet the right person. Don't be good for its own sake. Only when you stand to get something out of it. And the attempt at a Freudian excuse doesn't really work, because womanizing isn't tied to doesn't know how to do anything for himself. And the womanizer as flawed protagonist is such an overused trope, and the notion of having a strong female lead whip him into shape gives the implication that it's the woman's job to fix a flawed man, and then suddenly you have an I can change him fantasy. I saw this a lot over the last decade or so, where stories would promote themselves as feminists because they would feature a flawed male protagonist who is lectured or commanded into being better by a no-nonsense female lead, like how the 2019 Little Women made Laurie into a pillar of red flags. And it's not like Jasmine saying I'm not a prize to be won, and Aladdin recognizing that his posturing is just irritating her, or Belle saying no, you need to learn to control your temper, and the beast being receptive. Because there is a fine line between correcting your behaviour when she sets down a boundary, and girlfriend as the second mother or life coach, and the concept of flawed or jerk prince being humbled is really nothing new. We'd already seen the beast having to learn selflessness, John Smith having to change his views, and even Simba learning responsibility. Disney already did a whole movie about a royal brat who has to be humbled.
This story's about me, not him.
And like Naveen, Kuzco has no good qualities we're aware of before the character development, and that works because the movie is a comedy, whereas The Princess and the Frog is trying to be serious. It goes back to the idea of unintentionally centering the bad type of men in fiction and treating that as the default.
Do not kiss her.
Now just a second.
Like Womanizer as flawed hero, Kristoff spending the whole journey up the mountain being rude to Anna, live-action Beast insulting Belle's reading taste and knocking her out with a giant snowball, live-action Aladdin actually stealing from Jasmine, and hell, even Maui strands Moana in a cave on a desert island. Naveen's predecessors may have had flaws, but they also had virtues they demonstrated beforehand, and the movies saw them cultivating those virtues for the sake of character development. Why on earth should Tiana fall for this guy when she got turned into an animal because he coerced her into kissing him under false pretenses? Someone like that doesn't change overnight, and that is a problem because this movie has a clearly defined time frame, and unlike Cinderella, also has a clearly defined realistic setting that disqualifies it from being a fairy tale. And this is more of a pet peeve, but because this kind of character is centered in media so much, it draws less criticism than it should, because people are like, well, yeah, men, am I right? And so characters like Naveen who are walking red flags get treated as normal, whereas nefarious motivations get assigned to the classic princes, or even the Beast, who's an otherwise good person. And with Naveen, Disney also seemed to be trying to respond to the princess criticisms in a way that feels misguided. Pop culture says that the princesses just sit around waiting for a man to rescue them, and that only makes little girls dream of getting married and not being girl bosses. And while in hindsight I don't think Tiana qualifies as a girl boss, Naveen seems like an attempt to be like, look, we're showing how stupid royalty is, by presenting their prince as a spoiled rich boy who has to learn the importance of hard work and be commanded into a better person by a strong female lead. But since the movie sets itself in our world in a specific time, this shows a real misunderstanding of how royalty actually works, especially in its attempts to unpack how a hedonist might have become that way. Even if the monarchy in Maldonia doesn't run the country and are more figureheads like the British royal family, that's still very much a job and a lifestyle in its own right, full of duty and obligation that Naveen would realistically have been brought up in as the eldest son and heir to the throne, especially since they chose to set the movie only a decade after World War I. So Prince as metaphor for spoiled rich boy doesn't really work, especially since the umpteen other Disney movies that examine life as a royal all had the same narrative of the prince maturing because a prince and eventual king had a lot of responsibilities. And Aladdin had done the same with examining the pressures that come with being a princess. And even the spin-off material showed Aladdin getting instructions in how to help run a kingdom. So this attempt at subversion doesn't really subvert anything we haven't seen already, and much better. And really, Tiana deserved a much better love interest. She works herself to the bone for years just to be able to run her own business, and this is the guy she learns to loosen up for? What does Naveen do for her? Is he her ticket out of a difficult situation? Does he rescue her from a curse or monster? Does he validate her eccentricities when others don't? Does he see her as a person when others see her as a prize or tool for their own uses? A really cynical interpretation could argue that after all this pressure from her mother to find love and her friends to not work so much, she just goes with the first guy who shows interest in her. I would love for their wedding and declarations of love to hit as hard as the ones in the other movies, but unfortunately, this one is all payoff without the foundations needed to make it work.
My dream wouldn't be complete without you in it.
I originally had a whole conclusion written out tying this into everything from the death of sincerity in modern cinema, how works of art are now more data-driven than ever, and even how Disney's upcoming lineup consists mainly of sequels and remakes, but I was just depressing myself. I'm going to stop talking about how things are terrible because, hey, these 8 characters still exist and the lack of new stuff doesn't erase them. And chances are, even if there were new ones coming out, I'd still probably watch the older ones more anyway. I didn't give too much thought to the princes as a collection before taking on this video, since I even said in the princess one that Phillip and Aladdin were the only male characters in the fairy tale films that I really liked. But I ended up finding a lot of value in each of them. And who knows if I would have shamelessly consumed merchandise for a Disney Prince or Heroes franchise if there had been one back in the day, but I like to think I would. There exists this strange belief in society that men are simple and women are complicated, but examining these 8 characters and how I find something to like about each of them really shoots that to hell. And while dreaming of being a superhero or Jedi is fun, dreaming of being a Disney prince and picturing yourself as the hero of a fairy tale is also very appealing. I tend not to see myself too much in a lot of male characters because I'm about as far removed from convention as you can probably get. But with the Disney princes... And that's not even getting into my new theory that Quasimodo, Hercules and Tarzan are all autistic coded, but that's a topic for another video. And maybe I'm just from a different time, but I don't see a lot of bad messaging here, pre-2009 at least. I just see characters I can relate to and appreciate multiple things about. And if Naveen is that character for you, who am I to take that away?